I'm glad that we're able to continue to do these sessions via video technology, as much as I miss having the chance to do it in person with you. But hopefully we'll have a very good conversation today, despite the limitations. There's so much going on right now. I would say there's too much going on right now. I could use a little bit more calm and a little less anxiety in our country, but here we are, going through some rough times, and I look forward to hearing your views, your concerns, and your questions about all of it. I try to look at the optimistic side of things, and one of the things that makes me more optimistic than perhaps most is that I do think that most of our fellow Americans, certainly folks who live in our community, but as I look across the country, I think most of our fellow Americans are, in fact, pretty united on the big issues of the day. We have seen over the last several months the vast majority of Americans come together as one community to try to defeat the coronavirus. We've all accepted sacrifices in our lives, and some of us very, very deep sacrifices, to try to make sure that our friends and neighbors are safe from this disease. And although we are gradually trying to return to normal, we're not done doing that. I think it was an inspiring and remains an inspiring effort. And I think most of us did what we did, staying home, trying to limit our contact with other people, not because some politician told us we had to, but because we just knew it was the right thing to do, the responsible, decent thing to do. In the last week or so, the country has, if you watch the cable news, it sort of feels like we've been torn apart by the anger and fear that resulted from the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis. There have been demonstrations throughout the country. There have been demonstrations in our congressional district. And well, we'll, I'm sure, talk a lot about the details of what has been happening. But I do think that amidst all the apparent turmoil, it's important to note that, again, I think the vast majority of Americans agree that what happened to Mr. Floyd was deeply, deeply wrong, that any police officer who does something like that needs to be held accountable, that people have a right to protest when something like that happens, but at the same time, nobody should be using violence, no one should be inciting violence, and we need both to support our first responders and expect high standards of accountability from them. I think that's where most Americans are. There's a lot of, there are deliberate efforts to convince us that we are more divided than we actually are. There are people who, in a moment like this, seize upon disagreements and tensions to try to pit us against each other, whether it's pitting us against each other based on whether we're black or white, or pitting civilians against the police or people against their government. I think what we need right now is leadership that tries to calm things down, leadership that when it sees a fire burning says, where's the water, not where's the gasoline. Leadership that when it sees a problem in our country says, you know, I may not have created that problem, but it's my responsibility to try to fix it. And so that's what I've been trying my very best to do with your advice and with your input. I think we've made a lot of progress, for example, in the last couple of months in both creating and then fixing the programs that are helping people get through the coronavirus, through the economic shutdown. I've been working night and day, and my staff have been, to try to make sure that the programs Congress created for our small businesses, for folks who've lost their jobs, to make sure that those programs are available to every single person in our community. And we're doing a lot better today than we were a month or two ago. And in response to what happened in Minneapolis, Congress today, the House of Representatives is introducing, I think, a very responsible and very constructive piece of police reform legislation to try to actually solve these problems so that there's greater trust between police officers and the communities that they're sworn to protect and serve. Trust going both ways. We need that. I'm happy to talk about all of that stuff in far greater detail, but I expect it'll come up, so I will save the details for the question and answer session. I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys, and want to turn it back over now to DeAndre to start that part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. As the Congressman just mentioned, now is a good time to start submitting your questions. If you do have a question you would like to ask the Congressman live, please just use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. As mentioned before, please just put your name and the town that you're from. That'll be very important for us to identify who's asking the question. Tom, your first pre-submitted question: how likely will states like New Jersey and New York, who have been affected worse by COVID-19 virus, get financial aid from the federal government?
Well, we've gotten considerable financial aid from the federal government, but we need a good deal more. As the questioner rightly says, no part of the country has been affected more, and in fact, per person, New Jersey is the state that is most affected in the United States of America. So what have we managed to do, and what do we still need to do? Well, we established these programs that are there to help everybody. The PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, which provides forgivable loans to our small businesses to help them keep employees on board through this crisis. We've had 2 rounds of the PPP. The first one was a disaster in my view, and it was not great for New Jersey. We only had about 33,000 or so small businesses in New Jersey benefit from the law in that first round, and I think a lot of us saw the infuriating stories about much larger businesses that had no business getting a small business relief loan, like the Los Angeles Lakers basketball team, for example, being put ahead of the line by our banks. So before we released money for the second round, we tried to fix some of those problems. And since then, we've had about 100+ thousand, a little over 100,000 additional businesses in New Jersey receive loans. So more than 3 times as many in the second round as in the first round. And the average loan size, a lot smaller now, which indicates that the real small, the mom and pop shops that we wanted to help in the first place are in fact getting aid. The stimulus checks, the $1,200 checks, unemployment compensation with $600 boosted per week for every unemployed person, all of that is flowing to New Jersey. We also worked really, really hard in the legislation that has been enacted, that has been signed by President Trump, to provide generous assistance to our hospitals, to our local community health clinics, basically to our public health system. And New Jersey has benefited tremendously from that assistance as well. All of our hospitals in the 7th Congressional District have gotten generous assistance thus far. So that's the good news. What we still need, what we desperately need, what I am fighting hard for, is direct assistance to our state, county, and municipal governments. Because the problem they're facing, which all of us will be affected by, is that revenues are drying up because of the economic shutdown. Our state, county, our municipal governments, they have to balance their budgets. They can't, they can't spend fake money. And so if we do not find a way to provide them with some relief from the federal government, the only choices they're going to have are either, one, start laying people off. And for a lot of our municipalities, that's just going to mean first responders. It's going to be the police and fire departments, because they are by law required to fund the schools first. It could affect school budgets as well, depending on how hard a hit they take. So that's one option. Option 2, none of us want to see jacking up our property taxes even more to make up for the loss in revenue. So the HEROES Act, which we passed in the House of Representatives provides really generous assistance to state, county, municipal governments. Every municipal government in Hunterdon County would receive direct assistance under the HEROES Act. That's gone over to the Senate. That's what we're trying to negotiate about right now. We need to get the Senate on board with this, send it to the president, and get that done. That's my number one priority.
Thank you, Tom. Our next pre-submitted question is, can you give us an update on the status of the post office and the post office funding?
Yeah, so I just mentioned the HEROES Act. Again, this is the bill that we have already passed in the House of Representatives. And the HEROES Act funds the post office. It provides the relief that the post office, unfortunately, urgently needs to stay in business. And the reason for the need is it's not the coronavirus. It's not because the post office is being mismanaged or it's losing money. In fact, the post office is actually making a little bit of money on its regular mail service, on what we all know the post office to be doing. The reason it has this problem is because about 15 years ago, Congress foisted upon the post office a requirement to pre-fund its employees' pensions 50 years in advance, a requirement that no major US corporation, for example, has to meet. That has created a huge budget shortfall. The post office needs help. We need the post office even more today than we normally do, because if people are stuck at home, we're much more dependent on deliveries. We need the post office to have an election in November, so our very democracy depends on it. So again, it's in the HEROES Act. We passed it in the House. It's been sent to the Senate, and it's going to be part of the negotiation that we ultimately have on the next coronavirus piece of legislation.
Thank you again, Tom. Your next question: what legislation are you supporting to address the concerns about police violence and racial inequalities in our country?
Well, we introduced a piece of legislation today, which I am supporting. And as I said, I think this is a very pragmatic, very constructive piece of legislation that addresses exactly the concerns that have been raised by some of the violence that we have recently seen. Very, very importantly, it strengthens the ability of the Department of Justice to provide oversight when a police department experiences serious problems. This used to happen more often when many of you may remember the violence that ensued after a killing of an African-American man in Ferguson, Missouri in 2015. That problem was resolved by the Justice Department basically going in there, taking over temporarily the local police department, restructuring it, revamping its leadership, changing its policies and practices so that there would be more trust between the department and the community. That ability was undermined under Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and we're trying to restore it. We require much better collection, and you'd think this wasn't necessary, but it is, much better collection of data and statistics about cases involving violence between police and citizens around the country. Right now, we don't even have a good picture of the extent to which this is a problem and to whom and who bears the brunt of the problem. There's research on it, but there are not federal statistics that are gathered in a systematic way. We improve training of police officers around the country to conduct policing in a way that builds community trust. We provide grants to police department to do that kind of training. We ban certain forms of certain tactics that we think contribute to lethal incidents, like chokeholds, for example, which I personally don't think should be used except in the most dire circumstances where the life of the officer is directly at risk. We make it easier for civilians to get monetary damages if a police officer can be shown to have violated a citizen's constitutional rights. And we severely limit a practice that has been going on for some years in which the Department of Defense transfers surplus military equipment, including stuff that you just never want to see on the streets of an American city, armored personnel carriers, for example, to police departments across the country. I think this is really, really important. I want police officers to look like police officers. I don't want them to look like they're the 82nd Airborne parachuting into Iraq or Afghanistan. And I say this as somebody who I support the police. I had the daughter of a fallen police officer as my guest to the President's State of the Union this January. So, you know, this is actually about, as I keep on saying, building trust on both sides so that civilians are safer and police officers are safer and able to do their job even better. So anyway, this is what we're doing. You're going to see action on that bill in the House of Representatives by the end of the month. I expect us to pass it or something very, very close to what we've introduced today. And I would very much appreciate if everybody interested in this were to look at that bill, give me feedback over the next couple of days, see whether you think we've done a good job here. But I think it's a very, very important start, and we've got a chance right now, a chance to get bipartisan support for real reform.
Thank you, Tom. We will now kind of switch formats to our live questions. Just a reminder for everyone on the call, I know a few more people have joined the call since we started. If you do have a question, please just use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And please include your name, your question, and the town you're from. That helps us identify who's actually asking the question. And then once we call on you to ask your question, I will let you know in the chat feature when you're next. So please just make sure you're watching that. And then once we call on you, please just unmute yourselves. I can unmute you from my end. Sometimes it's a little funky and requires you to unmute yourself. So please just stand by to unmute yourself. If you're having any troubles or anything like that, I will be here to try to help you on my end and unmute you from my end. Our first question, live question, comes from Ed from Flemington. Ed, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. Good afternoon, Congressman. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Ed.
I wanted to ask, it seems as if things are spinning out of control a little bit lately. There is so much going on. I'm afraid that we're on the cusp of some Supreme Court decisions shortly on the ACA and also DACA that may be very disturbing. And I specifically wanted to ask about the ACA. I'm afraid that we've lost some of the focus or some of the momentum on that. That seemed like a winning issue in 2018 in the midterms. It was something that really a lot of people are concerned about, but it's almost gotten lost in the noise between, and I don't mean to trivialize certainly the events of the last week or so, and nor do I want to trivialize the events of the last several months with the virus, but the virus should play right into the need to make the ACA more robust, cover more people, do more things. And unfortunately, I'm not hearing, there should be a consensus on that. There should be a bipartisan consensus on that, and there's not. And I don't know how we get there.
So in a way, there is a bipartisan consensus. I mean, if you canvass members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, and if you could discover a way to get them to tell you what they really think, you would find that there is a consensus. And the coronavirus crisis crystallized it, because suddenly we have millions of our fellow Americans losing their jobs. And healthcare, for better or worse in America, is for most people tied to their job, because that's how we get our health insurance. So suddenly millions of people are losing their jobs. And what is their lifeline? Well, it's the Affordable Care Act. It's either going on one of the state exchanges and getting subsidized coverage, which, you know, if you've lost your job, you can do, even though this is not a normal enrollment period, or you benefit from expanded Medicaid coverage, which the ACA also provided and a lot of states accepted. There was an interesting moment recently where the Senator Cory Gardner, Republican senator in Colorado, who's up for re-election this year, was on one of these Zoom chats, just like we're having. And a constituent said, Senator, like, what am I going to do? I've lost my job. What am I going to do about healthcare? And he said, don't worry. The Affordable Care Act is there for you. And then people, of course, pointed out afterwards that Senator Cory Gardner voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That was his kind of public position. But when it came time to helping one of his constituents, he directed them to the ACA. So it's not a perfect law, but it provides a safety net for people who need it. It allows us to maintain something at least close to universal coverage in our country. And what's not getting enough attention is that right now, the Trump administration is in court, as you suggested, trying to get a judge to strike down the ACA. And when people ask the administration, all right, if it's struck down, what is your alternative? What will you do to make sure that everyone with a pre-existing condition can be covered without having their insurance rates jacked up? What will you do to make sure that children can stay on their parents' health insurance until they're 26 years old? The official answer of the administration is, we're not going to tell you until after the election. I can't imagine any intelligent person buying that. So that's what's happening. We don't know where the courts will end up on this. We don't know when the Supreme Court will ultimately rule. Is it going to be before November, after November? I don't know. All I know is I want people to be able to keep their health care, particularly in the middle of this terrible healthcare and economic crisis. The idea that we would be taking away, as it is, without putting anything in its place is just unthinkable to me. And I can tell you, you know, as a member of the House, I can't control what the court will do, but I can assure you that I will make sure the House of Representatives puts something immediately, like within a day, in place if the court strikes down the ACA. And I'm not as sure that the Senate will, but I think there will be tremendous pressure on the Senate to do the same thing as well. Everybody's got to keep their eye on this. It is of massive consequence to all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, for your question. Our next question comes from Emma from Highbridge. Emma, can you hear us?
Yes. You mentioned providing municipalities funding for police and other first responders in the HEROES Act. And my question is, at a time when so many people are calling for funds to be divested from the police and reinvested in nonviolent alternatives to policing, can anything be done in that legislation to encourage such use of the funds?
Yeah. Certainly we can encourage use of funds for all of the different interventions that our communities need to be more equitable and more safe. The legislation itself encourages that by providing the funding, by enabling the states to have the funding to do the things that their constituents want them to do. Let me step back a little bit, because I do want to be very straight with you on this question. I am absolutely convinced, I was before this crisis, I'm even more so today, that there are cultural and legal issues that have to be addressed to prevent abusive policing in this country, whether it's what happened to Mr. Floyd and others like him, or the way in which some of our, not all, but some of our police departments have dealt with public protest in the last several days. But I am not in favor of defunding the police. I think we need to think really, really carefully about this. If we're talking really, if we really mean that, what that means in practice is that either we will have police officers who are paid a lot less even than what they are paid today, in which case you're not going, that is not going to be a good way to achieve better policing, to have cops who are paid even less. Imagine who's going to take those jobs. Or you will have fewer police officers on the streets. And if we have fewer police officers, it's actually going to be significantly harder to do the kind of community policing where police officers live in and get to know people in the neighborhoods that they're supposed to protect, that has been shown to diminish instances of police violence and brutality. Los Angeles had this problem. One of the reasons why reformers in Los Angeles, one of the factors that they identified as being central to police abuses that occurred in that city for many years was that there were far too few police officers to serve a city of millions and millions of people. And when that happens, the tendency in the police is to stay in your fortress, to go out in armored vehicles with the heaviest guns you can find because you are outnumbered. So I don't think people have really thought through the implications of this. If the goal is to improve trust and diminish incidents of violence between the police and the community. So what I want, I'm very, very straight with this, and I know some people disagree. I actually want police officers to be paid better and to be held accountable more consistently. And what we are doing in the House of Representatives this week and over the next month is passing legislation that materially, concretely increases accountability and discipline and training and standards. That's what we need. And by the way, a slightly political point on this, and your question does allude to it, that there are a lot of people in the other party, the party I don't belong to, who are sort of gleefully jumping on this and saying, Democrats want to defund the police. Well, actually, they're the ones who voted to defund the police when they voted against the HEROES Act, which is all about funding our state, local, and county governments to pay for first responders. So give me a break.
Thank you, Emma, for your question. Tom, I will read the next question for the constituent, and I'll be quoting them. What more can Congress do in the short term before the presidential election to defend against Trump's march towards dictatorship? End of quote.
Well, you know what? I'm worried. I continue to believe that our country is resilient, that we have strong institutions, that we have people who may have different views about politics, who may belong to different political parties, but who fundamentally have the same values about what democracy is supposed to represent and what we should expect from our leaders. I have seen things in the last few days that both disturbed me, but also reinforced some of that confidence, including the very, very clear, explicit resistance that leaders in our armed forces have expressed to the president's efforts to try to politicize them, to enlist them in an effort to put down peaceful protest in Washington, D.C. and across the country. That I find confidence building, that our military is absolutely trying to play the right role here. But the fact that we are even talking about such a possibility is of great concern. And I have been thinking very hard about what I can do over the next coming months to make sure that our institutions can survive this very anxious period. You know, I mentioned the police reform legislation we're doing. On top of that, it's very important to me that we also consider some legislation to maintain the non-political nature of our armed forces, to back up what our military leaders have been saying. I'm very concerned about the appearance in Washington, D.C. of unidentified federal law enforcers, men in uniform, in riot gear with no insignia, who refuse to identify who they are, who they're working for. This is stuff I've seen in other countries and dictatorships. It's not something we tolerate in the United States of America, and there will be legislation introduced in the Senate, and I have expressed interest in doing so in the House as well, to ensure that no federal law enforcement, that every federal law enforcement agent identify themselves so that they can be held accountable. And then we have to make sure that the November elections are held in a climate that is consistent with our values and traditions and fair to everybody. We need to be very much on guard against organized voter suppression, either from a presidential campaign or external adversaries of the United States trying to sow distrust and confusion about our selection of the next president. So I'm, you know, I am in some still quite confident about our resilience and our ability to get through this, but also extremely vigilant.
Thank you, Tom. Our next live question comes from Matt. Matt from White House Station, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hi, Congressman. Thank you again for showing up at the protests in Flemington, and also for the other protests that you attended over the weekend. You talked about banning chokeholds. You talked about getting rid of qualified immunity, which I support, but I just want to see if I can get a little more insight for defunding the police, because I know how you said, you know, a short while ago and also on Friday that, you know, your idea of defunding the police would result in decreased salaries for police officers and therefore decreased officers patrolling the streets. But I just want to try to get you to challenge your preconceived notions. But because like I did start to agree with you on Friday, because like I was thinking, you know, if you're against Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and you're against Trump pulling out of the World Health Organization, you should be against defunding the police, because, you know, if you walk away from the problem without and just expect it to solve itself, nothing's going to happen. But then I started to realize that that's not exactly what people are saying when they say defund the police. So as I believe Emma tried to say, is that, yeah, they're trying to come up with nonviolent alternatives to securing public safety. And so what Minneapolis is trying to do, yeah, they're trying to do something. So like they're being sort of pioneering in what one form of defunding the police could look like. But then something that I came across in the past few days is that Camden, New Jersey, essentially defunded their police in one form after they had a very big spike in the number of homicides, where it was basically one murder a week. And since then, in the wake of efforts made to reform the police department and to what some people have called defund the police, there have been declines in murders and violent crime. So I would like to try to get you to sort of approach the conversation with some of an open mind, and not just like, oh, they're just going to cut the salaries of cops and we're not going to have as many officers working to protect us. So because I think that if you go head first with that kind of mindset, you'll sort of end up getting compared to people that were saying that the NFL players that were kneeling during the national anthem were disrespecting the flag instead of protesting police brutality.
Yeah.
So I
So
just,
Matt, here's what I'll tell you. First of all, you can always challenge my preconceived notions, assumptions, statements. That's what these conversations are all about. I expect to be challenged. But here's the thing. What Camden, New Jersey did was to reform its police department. They didn't defund the police. They had a police department that was, if you look at the statistics, totally ineffective, one of the highest murder rates in the country. There was corruption. And they basically got rid of a municipal police department and replaced it with a county force, and brought in a very well-known, very respected former police chief to lead the reform effort. And the results have been very good. Camden has significantly cut its murder rate, and there's just a lot more confidence and trust in that community between law enforcement and the people that they serve. That's what we should be talking about. I'm sure you can understand that when a lot of Americans hear the phrase defund the police, they think, well, that means you're defunding the police. You're just taking away the police, right?
I
And
agree with
so
that. So I mean, it is,
if you're using
it
a
is an improper
slogan that you
name.
then have to explain and say, oh no, it doesn't mean that, then it's probably the wrong slogan, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm reacting to. Like, I have to say, I have to react to what it sounds like and to what a lot of people think it means. So if what you're advocating for is that we encourage communities that have had trouble with policing, not everyone does, but some do, to experiment and to come up with reforms that increase trust. And sometimes that means bringing in a whole different kind of police force. If that's what that community wants to do, then that's fine. And one of the things we do in this bill is we actually provide resources for that, because guess what? It also costs money, right? To build something new from scratch. So I think that's the right way to talk about it. And if you do that, then you're not going to run into the very natural reaction that many good, decent people in this country have, that, oh my gosh, these kids are just trying to take away the police. And what do we do when somebody comes to our house with a gun and we can't call 911, right? We don't want that either. And by the way, if you care about equality, the last thing we need is a situation in this country where rich people hire their own police, right? Where rich people live in gated communities with armed private security, and poor people are left to fend for themselves because we don't have a police department. You don't want that either. So the way you talk about it is really, really important. And I think there's a way to talk about it where you and I would find ourselves very much in agreement.
Okay, yeah, I get that.
Right.
Like Cory was
Thanks.
kind of saying the same thing, how, he does support a lot of the reforms that you're talking about, but he similarly does not like the name defund the police, and I don't like it either. But I get what you're saying, and I appreciate your comments.
Good. Thank you, Matt.
I know this conversation kind of sparked a few other questions, so I will let Emma go ahead and kind of chime in a little bit on this one as well too. Go ahead,
So,
Emma.
I want to challenge that I did not use the word defund. That was actually you, Congressman, who used that first. I
Fair
said
enough.
divest and reinvest in alternatives. And when we're talking about maintaining or increasing police funding in a time when pretty much everyone is acknowledging that they're experiencing significant budget shortfalls, my question is, what other programs are experiencing budget cuts in their place? And studies have made very clear that increasing funding for mental health services, addiction services, education, both significantly reduce crime rates and improve standards of living, particularly in areas that have systemically had issues with funding those sorts of programs. And cities that have put in place policies to send non-police first responders to respond to mental health related emergency calls, homeless individuals, and et cetera, have had a lot of success because that allows both the communities to be safer and police officers who in many places are being sent into situations they do not have the proper training to handle safer as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you present it that way, I could not agree more. And just to be clear, in terms of what we're doing, the HEROES Act basically just provides funding for Highbridge, for Hunterdon County, for the state of New Jersey, to make up for revenues that are lost because of the coronavirus, right? It's not actually telling anybody how to spend that money. It's just making up for what would be otherwise a huge revenue shortfall. Those revenue shortfalls would result in cuts to all the stuff that you're talking about, including mental health services, including child protective services, including education, including Head Start programs and early childhood education, which are probably the most cost-effective investment we can have in preventing just about every kind of problem that our society suffers from. So it's kind of neutral in terms of what state and local municipal governments should do, but it would enable them to keep doing good things. There are a lot of municipalities, like small municipalities, that they don't actually run a lot of those programs because they're run mostly from the county and state level. And so when I talk to the mayors, when I talk to the city councils, what they say is, if we take this revenue hit, it's we still have to make our contribution to the county for the schools. So it's basically going to be the police and fire department. That's about that and the public works department, because that's really all they got. And so you are going to see a lot of first responders laid off and public works department people laid off. And again, I don't think we want to see that. That's not police reform. If we had a comprehensive set of public policies to address the kinds of issues that you're talking about, we might end up not having to spend as much on law enforcement. That would be great. I don't know a single police chief, responsible police chief in this country who wouldn't welcome that, actually. But we're not going to get there just through budget cuts. We're going to get there through positive incentives in alternatives, as you suggest.
Mm-hmm. I'd also argue, you were talking about Camden and switching to a county-wide policing system, and that in somewhere like Hunterdon, you've got a lot of small towns that do have their own police forces and don't necessarily need that, could be spread across 2 or 3 2-mile square towns. And that would, in order to have an officer on shift all the time, would help make up a lot of those budget shortfalls, I think.
Well, a lot of people have argued that from the standpoint of reducing property taxes. That's one of our big problems in New Jersey, is that we have so many municipalities, including some that are very small, and a lot of them want to have their own police and fire department and little city hall, and there's a lot of redundancy as a result. The problem is everybody says this, and everybody says we need more consolidation, except for my little town, which I want my little town to retain its own special character, but all the others should consolidate. So that's a long-standing debate in New Jersey. I try not to stick my neck into it because, I'll leave that to Highbridge and Clinton Township to discuss. My job is to try to make sure that the federal government does its part as best as possible to make sure that we get the help we need in moments of crisis. And this is a moment of crisis. There's no amount of consolidation of services that could get New Jersey through a crisis like this, when we have close to 20% unemployment and we've lost more than 12,000 lives, probably significantly more to coronavirus. So that's my number one priority. It's an emergency priority to get us through this difficult time. And if we can do that, then I think we'll be in better shape to address some of the things that you're talking about as well.
Thank you, Tom. And a good segue into the next question. I'll read it for the constituent. What is the status of COVID-19 testing availability for New Jersey?
So it's better than it was. I have been really pressing on this because without widespread COVID-19 testing and contact tracing, we can't safely reopen New Jersey. And we started out well behind. Actually, we were behind other states for quite some time. So every time I talk to the governor, this is number one issue, a conversation. We are now at a point where, you know, we not only have the drive-through testing location serving Hunterdon and Somerset County, which I helped to get going a while back. We now have testing increasingly available at pharmacies, at Walmart in Flemington has coronavirus testing right now. You know, so there are more opportunities for folks who are not immediately symptomatic to be able to get a test relatively quickly by making an appointment at one of these locations. And the state public health website should have an up-to-date list of all the locations in our community where you can get tested. And again, we want to get to a point, we're closer to it, but we're not quite there yet, where anybody, for any reason, let's say, you know, you just want to know that you're safe going back to work or school, or maybe you own a business and you want your employees to be tested before they come back, where anybody can just go to the local drugstore, say, I want a test, and get a test. And then come back even 2 weeks later if you want to keep doing it to make sure that you're safe. Because right now the diagnostic tests are more reliable than the antibody tests. So I'm going to keep at it, both you know, pressing our state authorities to do their job and trying to make sure that the federal government provides resources. I'm a broken record on the importance of the HEROES Act. It provides a significantly greater share of resources to states to set up these widespread testing and contact tracing systems that we need.
Thank you, Tom. At this point, we don't have any more live questions submitted, so I will turn it back over to you, Tom, for closing remarks.
Excellent. And why don't we just wait a moment if there's anybody else who does want to chime in, speak now, or I won't say forever because we'll do this again soon, but until the next time. If not, then again, thank you everybody so much for getting on the call with me. These are difficult and challenging times, and as a result, we face some difficult and challenging questions, and I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm doing my best. And one thing that helps me do my best is that I hear from you all very, very often. You guys guide me as to what my priorities ought to be, challenge my assumptions, as we heard, and rightly so, and force me to think in new ways about issues that even the ones that I've been working on all my life. I'm constantly being shown new perspectives and new ways of thinking about what should be done. And so I'm really, really grateful to all of you for participating in this session and for continuing to stay in touch with me as I try to serve you in the House of Representatives. So until we meet again, either on Zoom or in person, thank you, everybody. Please stay healthy and safe and continue to stay in touch. Thanks.